You know, people don't believe you when you start a sentence with, I swear it's true, so I'm not going to waste my breath with that. But I will say this, what I'm about to tell you happened. Every detail, every sound, every feeling of dread, it's all burned into my memory. It was summer, one of those blazing sunny days that makes you wish you were anywhere but outside. But when your job is swinging axes and hauling logs as a lumberjack, you get used to being hot, sweaty, and uncomfortable. It was me, my buddy Dale, who worked with me in the yard, and my cousin Joe, who tagged along because he was bored and had nothing better to do. We were driving through Nebraska, somewhere deep in the Great Plains, on our way to a job in Colorado. Long stretches of empty highway, fields that seemed to go on forever, and not much else. It was the kind of drive where you almost forget the world exists outside of your car. We stopped at this little gas station in the middle of nowhere. You know, the type, one pump, a little convenience store attached to a restroom you'd rather hold it than use. The kind of place that feels like a time capsule from the 1950s. Joe and I went inside to grab drinks while Dale filled up the truck. The clerk behind the counter, a wiry old man with skin like weathered leather, gave us a half nod when we walked in. He was one of those types that looked like he'd been standing behind the counter his whole life. I grabbed a soda and Joe was poking through the candy rack when the old man spoke up. "You boys traveling far?" "Colorado," I said. The man grunted. "Well, don't stick around here too long. This land's got its stories." I laughed a little, more out of politeness than anything. "What kind of stories?" The man narrowed his eyes, like he was deciding if he wanted to tell us. "Wendigo country," he said finally. Joe froze mid-reach for a candy bar. "You're joking," he said. "Wish I was," the old man replied. "People go missing out here. Some say it's coyotes. Others say it's something worse." Now, I'd heard of Wendigos before. Campfire stories, mostly a creature born out of desperation and hunger. Something that was once human, but isn't anymore. I always thought it was just an old myth to keep people from wandering too far into the woods. Joe snorted. "Wendigo? Come on, that's just..." The old man cut him off. "Believe what you want, but keep your eyes open." We paid for our stuff and left, laughing about the old guy and his tall tales. But something about the way he said it stuck with me. Anyway, we got back on the road, but about 20 minutes later, Dale pulled over. "Truck's overheating," he said, popping the hood. We were in the middle of nowhere, with fields stretching out in every direction. The sun beat down on us, and the heat shimmered off the asphalt. Dale was tinkering with the engine, while Joey and I stood around, swatting at flies and complaining about the heat. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was the heat playing tricks on my eyes. Something moved in the distance, just beyond the field. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, and it moved with the jerky, unnatural gait. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Joe squinted. "See what?" "There, in the field." By the time he looked, it was gone. He rolled his eyes. "Man, you've been listening to too many stories." But I knew what I saw. A few minutes later, Dale cursed under his breath. "We're not going anywhere for a while," he said. "I've got to let it cool down." We decided to stretch our legs and walked a little ways into the field. I kept glancing around, feeling like I was being watched. But I didn't say anything. No sense freaking the guys out. That's when we heard it. A low guttural growl that didn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. It was deeper, more menacing. "Did you hear that?" Dale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We turned, and there it was. Standing at the edge of the field, half hidden by the tall grass, was the creature. It was taller than any man, with gaunt, elongated limbs and sunken, hollow eyes. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. For a moment, none of us moved. Then the creature tilted its head, as if it was studying us, and took a step forward. "Run," I said, my voice cracking. We bolted back toward the truck, but the creature didn't follow. It just stood there, watching us, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. We piled into the truck, locking the doors. even though we knew that wouldn't do much if it decided to come after us. What the hell was that? Joey whispered, his face pale. Wendigo, I said, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Dale got the truck started, and we peeled out of there, not stopping until we hit the next town. I don't know what it wanted or why it let us go. Maybe it was toying with us, or maybe it decided we weren't worth the trouble. But I'll tell you this, I'm never going back to the Great Plains. Alright, so here's what happened. I've thought about it 1,000 times, replayed every second in my head, and no matter how many times I go through it, I still can't wrap my head around it. It was early October, one of those cloudy, overcast days where the sun barely breaks through and the air feels heavy. I just finished a 72-hour shift at the firehouse back home in Wichita, Kansas, and decided to take a break with some old friends. There was me, David Miller, my buddy Jason, who's a mechanic, and Todd, who's an electrician. We've all been tight since high school, and every couple of years we get the itch to hit the road and just drive. No plans, no itinerary, just an open plains, a cooler full of snacks and miles of highway ahead of us. We set out early in the morning, heading west through the Great Plains. The landscape out there is endless, just rolling hills and stretches of grassland that go on forever. It's peaceful in a way, but also kind of unnerving, like you're standing at the edge of the world and could fall off at any moment. We're about 2 hours past any sort of civilization when the truck's fuel gauge started dipping dangerously close to empty. We've gotten lazy about refueling, thinking we'd hit another town soon enough, but this stretch of road, there was nothing, no signs, no turnoffs, not even an abandoned gas station. Jason was behind the wheel. We've got maybe 10 miles left, he said, glancing at the gauge. Great, Todd muttered. Stranded in the middle of nowhere. Fantastic. Then, like a gift from the universe, we spotted a dirt road off to the right with a wooden sign that read Crane Hollow 2 miles. The handwriting looked hand-painted, and the whole thing had this eerie, forgotten vibe to it. But we were desperate. Let's check it out, I said. Jason turned the truck onto the dirt road, and we bumped along until we reached what could generously be called town. It wasn't much, just a handful of weathered buildings, a small general store, and a house or two. The place looked abandoned, like it hadn't seen life in decades. We pulled up in front of the general store, and Jason killed the engine. You sure this is a good idea? Todd asked. Not really, I admitted, but we don't have a lot of options. The three of us climbed out, the crunch of gravel under our boots the only sound. The air was still, and I mean still. No wind, no birds, no rustling grass, just silence. We headed inside, the door creaking loudly as we pushed it open. The shelves were dusty and half empty, but there were a few cans of food, some bottled water, and thank God, a rusty old gas pump out back. Jason and Todd started grabbing supplies while I walked toward the back of the store. That's when I saw it, movement, out the corner of my eye. I froze. At first I thought it was just my reflection in the cracked glass of the display case, but then it moved again. Something darted past the window outside, low and fast. My stomach tightened. Guys, I called out, keeping my voice low. Something's out there. Jason looked up from the bag of chips he was holding. What do you mean, something? I don't know, I said, stepping closer to the window. I saw something. It was fast. Todd came over and peered outside. Probably a coyote, he said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. We grabbed what we needed and headed out to the gas pump. Jason started filling up the truck while Todd and I kept watch. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes were on us from every direction. And then we saw it. It was standing at the edge of the field, maybe 50 yards away. At first glance it looked like a deer. Its body was thin and angular, and its skin was pale and stretched taut over its bones. But then it moved, and I realized it wasn't a deer. It stood up on two legs, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, they were wrong. Too big, too dark, and filled with something I can only describe as hunger. Jesus Christ, Jason whispered, dropping the gas nozzle. The thing started moving towards us, slow and deliberate. "Get in the truck," I yelled. We scrambled into the cab, slamming the door shut just as the creature reached the edge of the lot. Jason turned the key and the engine roared to life, but the thing didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching us with those empty, black eyes. We peeled out of there, tires kicking up dirt as we sped back toward the highway. I looked back once, and it was still there, standing in the middle of the road. Its head tilted, as if it was listening. We didn't stop driving until we hit the next town, and even then, none of us spoke for a long time. Later that night, when we were safe in a motel room, I remembered something. A couple of years ago, I watched this documentary about Native American folklore, and they'd mentioned something called a skinwalker, a shapeshifter that could take the form of animals and people. I didn't believe it at the time, but now I'm not so sure. Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. This time we're checking out stories from the Great Plains. Thank you very much for listening to the stories, and I hope you enjoy them. I'm trying to narrate them myself now. I enjoy this. If you also do, please drop me a comment, drop me a like, and let me know. And now, let's check out the rest of the stories. Alright, let me tell you what happened. I still get chills just thinking about it, honestly. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. My name's Sylvester Johnson. I work as a lumberjack and I've spent most of my adult life outdoors, cutting down trees, hauling timber, and hunting in my free time. You'd think I'd be used to the wilderness by now, right? But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that week. It all started last autumn. I'd taken a trip out to Kansas, the heart of the Great Plains, to help out my buddy Greg. He owns his big piece of land out there, acres of grassland bordered by a patch of dense woods. Greg's been renovating an old farmhouse on the property, turning it into some sort of weekend getaway spot. He invited me and two other friends, Rick, a mechanic, and Tommy, a trucker, to help him with some of the heavier work. I brought along my dog, Rocky. He's a big muscular mutt, the kind you'd want by your side if you ever ran into trouble. Rocky's been my hunting partner for years, and he's never been spooked by anything until that week. The first couple of days went by without a hitch. The weather was perfect, sunny skies and crisp autumn breeze, and we spent our days hammering, sawing, and joking around. At night, we'd sit around the fire pit, grilling burgers and telling stories. On the third night though, everything changed. It started with the howling. We were sitting outside, the fire crackling, when this low guttural howl echoed across the plains. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. I know those sounds like the back of my hand. This was deeper, almost like a growl mixed with a scream. "What the hell was that?" Rick asked, his face pale in the firelight. "No idea," Greg said, but he didn't sound convinced. Rocky, who'd been laying at my feet, shot up like a rocket. His ears pinned back and his tail tucked between his legs. He started growling, low and steady, staring out toward the woods. "Relax, boy," I said, patting his head, but he wouldn't take his eyes off the tree line. We all stood there for a while, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually we brushed it off and went to bed, figuring it was just some animal passing through. The next night though, things got worse. We were back around the fire, talking about some YouTube videos I'd seen about cryptids. I brought up the dogman, the creature I'd heard about in a documentary. Supposedly it's this half-man half-wolf thing that stalks the Midwest, attacking livestock and terrifying anyone unlucky enough to see it. Greg laughed it off, but Rick looked uneasy. "Well, whatever it is," Rick said, "let's hope it doesn't show up here." That's when we heard the scratching. It came from the side of the house, long, slow scrapes like claws raking against wood. We all froze. "Greg, you got raccoons or something?" Tommy asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked. "Not that big," Greg said, grabbing a flashlight. We followed him to the side of the house, Rocky leading the way with his teeth bared. Greg clicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the wall. The siding was shredded. Deep gouges ran down the wood, fresh enough that splinters were still on the ground. "What could have done that?" I asked, but no one answered. That's when we saw it. At the edge of the flashlight's beam, just beyond the fence, something was standing. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and covered in thick matted fur. Its head was canine, with a long snout and glowing eyes that reflected the light like a predator's. It stared at us for a moment, then let out a low guttural growl that made my stomach drop. "Inside," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." We backed toward the house, never taking our eyes off the creature. It didn't follow, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching. That night, none of us slept. We barricaded the doors and windows, armed ourselves with whatever we could find: an old shotgun Greg kept in the closet, a couple of crowbars, and even a fire axe. The next morning we found more scratches on the house. The barn doors had been ripped off their hinges, and the truck's tires were slashed. By the time the sun started to set, we knew we couldn't stay another night. We packed up what we could and decided to make a run for it. The plan was to head down the dirt road to the highway and flag down a car. It didn't go smoothly. Halfway to the main road, the creature attacked. It came out of nowhere, slamming into the side of the truck and nearly tipping it over. We scrambled out, weapons in hand, and tried to fight it off, but it was too fast, too strong. I'll never forget the sound it made, a mix between a snarl and a scream, like it was enjoying itself. We managed to distract it long enough to make a run for the highway. Rocky stayed by my side, barking like mad, and somehow we made it. A trucker driving a big rig spotted us and pulled over. We jumped in, shouting for him to drive, and he didn't ask questions. When I looked back, the creature was standing in the middle of the road, watching us go. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, and even then none of us spoke for a long time. I don't know what we saw that week, but I know one thing for sure: I'm never going back to that farmhouse. You want to know the most terrifying experience of my life? Alright, but don't say I didn't warn you. This story still gives me nightmares, and I've seen some messed up things in my time as a soldier. I'm Chuck Hayes, born and raised in Boulder, Colorado. I grew up loving the outdoors, but I also had a thing for technology, building custom computers, tweaking hardware. That's my hobby when I'm not on duty or out exploring. But nothing about my training or hobbies could have prepared me for what happened that summer in the Great Plains. It was late July, cloudy skies hanging overhead like a lid about to seal us in. My friends and I, Jonah, my old army buddy, and Sarah, a paramedic, decided to go hiking out in Kansas. Flatlands, endless skies, and this trail that cut through a small grove of trees before looping back around to a dirt road. It sounded like a relaxing way to spend the day. We started mid-morning, the air humid and thick, but not unbearable. We were about 4 miles in when the first sign of trouble appeared. Jonah stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the ground. "What's up?" I asked, stepping beside him. He pointed at the dirt. Tracks, huge, deep impressions, like something heavy and two-legged had been walking through the area. They weren't boot prints though. The toes were too long, almost claw-like. "Bear?" Sarah asked, though she didn't sound convinced. "No bears in these parts," I said, "and even if there were, they wouldn't leave prints like that." We kept moving, but an uneasy silence fell over us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The grove of trees loomed ahead, dark and dense, and for the first time I wasn't looking forward to stepping into the shade. As we entered the grove, the air felt cooler, heavier. The birds stopped chirping. That's when Sarah whispered, "Do you hear that?" We all stopped, straining our ears. At first I didn't catch it, but then there it was, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. Jonah unslung the small hatchet he'd brought for chopping firewood, and I felt a pang of regret for not bringing anything more substantial than my multi-tool. We moved slowly, scanning the trees, but we didn't see anything. Still the rustling persisted, following us, always just out of sight. "Whatever it is, it's keeping its distance," Jonah muttered. "Yeah, for now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We made it out of the grove and onto a small clearing. The sun should have made me feel better, but it didn't. The rustling had stopped, but that only made it worse. It was like the calm before the storm. That night we decided to camp near the dirt road. None of us wanted to admit we were too spooked to go back through the grove in the dark, but it was obvious. We set our tents, made a fire, and tried to shake off the tension. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and close. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was down to embers, casting faint shadows, but I didn't see anything. Then Jonah's voice hissed from the other tent. "Chuck, you see it?" "See what?" I whispered back. "There's something out there, man." I crawled out of my tent, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Jonah was already out, holding his hatchet. Sarah joined us, a hunting knife in her hand. The three of us stood there, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the dim firelight from the edge of the clearing. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew, and they didn't blink. "Back to the tents," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We moved slowly, but the eyes followed us, disappearing and reappearing, as whatever it was circling the clearing. "It's toying with us," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Let it toy," Jonah muttered. "It gets too close, I'll show it what the hatchet can do." The creature didn't attack that night, but none of us got any sleep. By dawn we decided we couldn't stick around any longer. We packed up camp as quickly as we could, constantly glancing over our shoulders. The creature was nowhere in sight, but we all felt its presence. We made our back toward the dirt road, sticking close together. That's when we heard it again, the rustling, but this time it was faster, more erratic. "Run!" Jonah shouted, and we took off. I don't know how we managed to make it to the road without tripping over ourselves, but we did. A pickup truck was coming down the road, and we flagged it down, practically throwing ourselves in front of it. The driver, a farmer in his 60s, looked at us like we were crazy, but he didn't argue when we begged him to take us to the nearest town. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The creature was standing at the edge of the road, its massive frame silhouetted against the morning light. It didn't follow us, but its eyes never left us. When we finally reached the town, the farmer asked what had happened. None of us could explain it, not really. We just said we'd seen something we couldn't explain. To this day, I don't know what that creature was. Maybe it was a skinwalker, like the stories I've heard. Maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I'll never go hiking in the Great Plains again. Thank you for sticking around until the end, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the stories, and now, good night.